NewsMaxTV.com, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, email. It's all right there. Also, NewsMaxTV. It's the Joe Pack Show. Glad to have you here. Really glad to have author Peter Dabrowska on. He's written a great book. It's called Enemies, the Press versus the American People. Peter, how are you?
I'm doing well, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really good to have you on. You know, we've had this discussion about the media versus this president for a long time, but it really is the left wing. I call them the legacy media. Many people call them the mainstream media. And the president has said over and over, fake news is the enemy of the people. And the media freaks out like, oh my God, how dare you question my integrity? Well, from what I understand, and I haven't seen the book yet, but from what I understand, you've taken a bunch of examples that prove that they are exactly who the president says they are, and you put them in your book. Am I getting the whole thesis, the hypothesis of the book is the media sucks, I'm going to prove it?
That's right. So it's pretty straightforward. I do, in the course of my daily work as a reporter, I cover the mainstream media beat a lot, and so I had so many examples of how terrible the corporate press was that I decided that I would compile all that information into a book. So yeah, as you can imagine, I mean, it's example after example after example of just mainstream press duplicity and how they behave in a way that's, it doesn't comport to, what the average ordinary American believes.
Right. You could actually probably do an entire book on Jim Acosta, couldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it's interesting that you mentioned Jim because his book, which is, I haven't read his book, but I can only imagine how sort of self-congratulatory it is.
Right.
His book just came out a few weeks ago. It's called Enemy of the People, A Dangerous Time to Be a Reporter in America, or something like that. And this, I think my book is going to be an interesting answer to his.
Yeah.
So his book is all about how the press is not the enemy. Mine is about how the press is, in fact, the enemy. And I think I have more evidence.
And I look forward to seeing it. It's Peter Dabrowska. It's D''ABROSCA. Is it Dabrowska on Twitter, or is your first name in there too?
It's just P. Dabrowska, so P like Peter Dabrowska.
Okay, again, D''ABROSCA. Go and follow him on Twitter. Get this book, Enemies, the Press of the American People. It's always jumped out at me about Acosta, and you don't know me much, but I was a journalist for many, many years, a television news anchor. I won a bunch of awards and stuff. I know how to do the job. About Acosta, he seems to think the job is about him. When I was a journalist, I never, ever did a story on me. Ever. And I was never a character in the story or a part of the story. Or when I asked the question, he was forced to answer. I wasn't even that guy. But Acosta seems to think that it's his job to stand up on the world stage and say, Mr. President, will what you're about to say pass a fact check? Who asks that question? So, and other than focusing on him because he's the most egregious in my mind. But that's really what it is, right, Peter? These reporters think they're the story.
Yeah, that's right. And so it used to be a rule, and you're exactly right. It used to be a rule that reporters did not want to make themselves the story.
Yeah.
But it seems that rule has flown out the window in sort of this craze to get Donald Trump, right? Like they view their job as an opportunity to protect the sort of limousine liberals and the coastal elitists and the established order that we have. And they view Donald Trump, and not only Donald Trump, but Donald Trump's supporters by extension, as their enemy because he came in and he's been talking about the average ordinary American and trying to represent them for the past 2.5 years. So in their haste to discredit everything Donald Trump does, they've made a ton of mistakes, and consequently they've become the story themselves.
And the president's his sin was that he won. That's the real problem, right? I mean, he didn't really do anything. I mean, he started going after the media after they went after him, but they still are beside themselves because of the result of 2016, no?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the crime is that Trump won, not that a Republican won, right? If Jeb Bush or, Carly Fiorina or any of those establishment Republicans had won,
right,
you would have seen a little bit of press backlash, right? Maybe like you saw during the Bush days. But it wouldn't have been nearly this intense. Really, the crime is that Trump, being an outsider, a political outsider, won, not just that he's a Republican.
Now, I haven't seen the book yet, and I can't wait to get it. I want everybody to go and get it. Enemies, the Press versus the American People. The author is Peter Dabrowska. But I'm going to throw out a couple of examples that I know, and you tell me if they're in the book or not. And maybe you can give me a couple of other examples if you'd like. But after Steve Scalise was shot, the media reported, I think CNN posted that the Democrats all prayed around second base, when in fact it was the Democrats and the Republicans all on their knees praying around second base. Oops, we forgot to mention the Republicans. I believe it was Acosta who said that President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump went to the hospital but did not visit Steve Scalise, which of course was untrue. They walked into the room and spent time with him. I mean, it's story after story after story. Give me some egregious ones that we can read more about in the book.
Sure. So I didn't write about the Steve Scalise incident, but that is a perfect, classic example, right? Donald Trump goes and does something great after Steve Scalise is shot by a rabid leftist, by the way,
right.
And the press still finds a way to knock him for that, right? One of the big focuses, though, in the book is fact checkers. This is a big point for me, right?
Yeah.
So we have sort of the established media order, and then we have the established media fact checkers like Snopes and like PolitiFact and like these organizations. AP now does this, where they say, they're the arbiters of truth, right? This is what is true and this is what is false. And sometimes they wind themselves up in crazy webs just to try and prove the established Democratic Party narrative correct. And it's so transparent. It's so obvious that I wrote a whole chapter on that. And then, another thing that I like to talk a lot about is the media fomenting violence. And I think this is particularly relevant today.
Right.
Chris Cuomo and Don Lemon both go on CNN in prime time and defend Antifa violence. On two separate occasions, I think Cuomo said that not all punches are morally equal, right? So if you punch a Nazi, that's better than a Nazi punching you, right? And Don Lemon said something similar, and what you see now is journalists like Andy and Go in Portland getting attacked and beaten in the streets by Portland Antifa, all brought to you by, advertised by, supported by the mainstream press. I mean,
and by the way, that story, as you know, is hardly covered by the mainstream press. That story was a blurb. It was a quick mention. Had that been somebody in the left press, like Acosta gets punched, and I don't want that to happen, but let's say that happens, this would be the biggest story for about a month. And when the guy, I think he said Go, I think he pronounces it No, but the guy Indy No is out there. He's gay. First of all, nobody mentions that in the mainstream media. He goes and he's just covering, as a conservative guy, he's covering Antifa and whatever this get-together is, and he gets hit in the face with like contact cement. And that's okay. That's no big deal, because I guess in Cuomo's world, that's like punching a Nazi. But I want to go back to the fact checkers, though, because I think you make an incredible point. And again, it's Peter Dabrowski. Go and get his book. It's called Enemies, the Press versus the American People. It's out when? In 6 days, right? No, in 4 days, on the 16th of July. Right. So go and get this. I think you could probably pre-order it now, Peter, yes?
That's correct, yep.
Okay, hopefully people will go and do that. But the fact-checking system that's put in place is a mechanism of the progressive left of this country. That's what it is. You say it, Jim, we'll back you up, and we'll make up all the crap we have to make up to show that you're right. And the real problem is people think they're separate entities. I mean, one of the biggest fact-checkers is the Washington Post. How does the Washington Post fact check when the Washington Post just had to apologize to James O'Keefe for lying and misquoting him in some of these reports that some of these undercover investigations he did in Project Veritas, exposing the social media outlets. So what do you tell people who are watching and listening? When they want a real fact checker, what do they do? Because if you go to Google, the first 10 answers are going to be leftist. And then if you get to page 2 or page 3, you might see some real facts. What do you do?
So my advice to people when searching for news is to go read partisan news, right? Yeah. In my view, the problem with cable news, like outlets like CNN and MSNBC, is not that they are partisan. It's not that they are left-wing. It's that they pretend to be unbiased, okay? So I would much prefer that everybody reads news and understands the bias of the news organization that they're reading, and that those news organizations wear their biases on their sleeves. That's what we do in conservative media, right?
Yes.
We say, look, we work for conservative news websites. We're going to give you the news from a conservative angle. If you don't like that, you don't have to read it. Honestly, I wish CNN would come out with an apology one night in primetime and have Anderson Cooper get up there and say, hey, look, we've been lying to you for a lot of years, pretending that we're unbiased. As it turns out, we're all leftists. At least then I could have a little bit of respectability for Anderson Cooper and say, okay, he's finally not trying to, pull the wool over my eyes, right? I would say find news that is openly partisan and you will be okay. As long as you understand the bias, I think that's better than being lied to implicitly every time you turn on cable.
Well, I agree with you. It is Enemies, the Press versus the American People. Peter Dabrowski is the author. At PDABROSCA on Twitter. Go and follow him right now. You bring up a good point. Rachel social Maddow, as much as I disagree with her, I know where she's coming from. I know that she's a leftist. I know that she's progressive. I know this is her vision of the country is different than my vision of the country, and I can appreciate and respect the fact that she's putting that out on her sleeve. Anderson Cooper pretends to be a news guy. Acosta actually was on, I think, with Don Lemon, or being interviewed by somebody on his own network, and they were talking about how they don't hate Trump and they're not biased against Trump. They're just telling the truth. And that's therein lies the problem, because for many, many years, when you watch Bernie Shaw and you heard him crawling around in Iraq as a war was breaking out around him, you could trust that he was a news guy and he was going to tell you what he was actually experiencing. You're not getting that from CNN now, so all their bona fides or bona fides, however you want to pronounce it, are out the window. I mean, that's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There is no basis on which they could possibly claim to be unbiased at this point. I mean, it's just, if you watch cable news on a daily basis, you will have a completely opposite worldview of somebody who, say, doesn't watch cable news and gets their news from Drudge Report, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like you'd be living in an alternate reality. You wouldn't recognize the other side if you don't do it for a living, which I believe is why, there's such a big partisan division in this country now. It's people who watch cable news are literally living in an alternate reality where Donald Trump is a Nazi and he's got people in, detention camps,
right.
And the rise of fascism is coming to America, and the show Handmaid's Tale is becoming a reality, right? And none of that obviously is true, but you wouldn't know that if all you watched was CNN.
That's a great point.
That's part of the problem.
In the lead up that I got to the book, and last question, because I don't want to leave this out, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this. It says that it's hilarious and it's a very funny look. So you take us on the road and you give us fact about how they've gotten it wrong, and then what do you do? Make fun of them? I mean, what's the funny angle? Help me out here.
So, a lot of it is centered around poking fun at these people, right? Because I believe one of the most effective tools against them is to make fun of them. They hate that. They really take offense to that. And so, one of the ways that I kind of make my points about the media is by showing them contempt. And I believe that, ordinary Americans do that currently and should continue to do that. It's one of the best ways to fight back against them. It makes them insecure about themselves. So, there's one second, I can give you a brief example. When Don Lemon was talking about how Antifa is not a fascist organization because its name is Antifa, I'm sitting there going, wait a second, that's your logic? Like, how are you going to explain to people that raspberries aren't actually berries?
Exactly
like,
right. If you call them anti-raspberry, exactly right.
Right. Like, what if I get, tennis elbow from playing racquetball? Does that mean that I don't have tennis elbow? So these are the kind of things that I point out in the book, right? And it's kind of, I like to poke fun at them.
They're so surly and they're so arrogant and they're so confident that they're right and everybody else is wrong, or their worldview is right. It really doesn't matter how they're reported as long as they get their end result. I love that you're taking them down in this book. It's called Enemies, the Press versus the American People. His name is Peter Dabrowska. It's PDABROSCA over on Twitter. Go follow him and get this book. Peter, thanks a million. I appreciate you.
Thanks, Jeff, for having me. Thank you.
All right, we're back.